In the scorching November of 1177, beneath the merciless sun of the Holy Land, a moment was approaching that would rewrite the rules of what humanity believed possible in warfare. The dusty roads leading to Jerusalem trembled under the weight of an approaching apocalypse. 26,000 warriors, the finest soldiers Islam had ever assembled, marched in perfect formation toward the holy city. Their commander was a name that froze Christian blood in their veins: Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, the man who had sworn before Allah to reclaim Jerusalem and wash the sacred stones with Crusader blood. His army stretched across the horizon like a dark ocean, their polished scimitars reflecting sunlight in blinding flashes, their war drums creating a rhythm that sounded like the heartbeat of doom itself. The scouts who survived their approach brought reports that seemed impossible to believe. Cavalry units numbered in the thousands, archers whose arrows could darken the sky, siege engines capable of reducing stone walls to rubble, supply trains that stretched for miles. This was not a raiding party. This was conquest incarnate. In Jerusalem, the situation bordered on catastrophic. The kingdom's main military force had marched north to confront a different threat, leaving the holy city defended by a skeleton garrison of aging veterans and untrained militia. The great fortresses stood undermanned. The walls, which had witnessed miracles before, now seemed like nothing more than monuments to a Christianity about to be erased from the Levant. But there was one man who refused to accept the mathematics of doom. Baldwin IV, king of Jerusalem, was 16 years old. His face, once beautiful, was being slowly consumed by leprosy, a disease that marked him as cursed in the eyes of many. His hands were wrapped in silk bandages to hide the deteriorating flesh. When he walked, he did so with the stiffness of someone fighting against their own bodies. Betrayal. Court physicians had given him perhaps 5 more years to live, maybe less. Many nobles whispered that God had abandoned their kingdom, that their king's disease was divine punishment. But Baldwin's mind remained sharp as Damascus steel, and his courage burned with the intensity of a man who knew every battle might be his last. When the reports reached him that Saladin's massive army was approaching not from the expected north but from the vulnerable south, heading toward the coastal cities before turning on Jerusalem itself, Baldwin made a decision that his advisors called suicide. He would not wait behind walls. He would not pray for rescue from the northern army that couldn't return in time. He would ride out with whatever force he could gather and confront Saladin in open battle. The council chamber erupted in protest. Veterans who had survived decades of warfare pleaded with their young king to see reason. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers argued for defensive positions. Merchants begged him to negotiate. But Baldwin silenced them all with words that would echo through centuries. If we hide behind walls, we die slowly, and Jerusalem falls. If we ride out, we might die quickly, but we die as men who chose their fate. Gather whoever will follow. We march at dawn. The force that assembled in the cold pre-dawn darkness was a study in desperation. 500 knights. Perhaps a few hundred more if you counted the poorly armed sergeants and desperate volunteers. Many were Templars, warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and perpetual warfare against the enemies of Christ. They wore white surcoats marked with red crosses, their faces hidden behind iron helmets, their eyes reflecting nothing but grim determination. These were men who had survived the brutal gauntlet of Templar training, who could recite prayers while splitting a man from shoulder to saddle. But even Templars could count. 500 against 26,000 was not a battle. It was martyrdom with extra steps. Yet not one man turned back. They had chosen their king, their faith, and their fate. Baldwin himself caused whispers of awe and pity when he appeared. He could barely grip his reins with his bandaged hands. He had to be helped onto his horse, a massive white destrier that seemed to understand the importance of remaining steady beneath its fragile master. But when he raised the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, a piece of wood said, to be from Christ's own crucifixion, something changed in the air. The Bishop of Bethlehem held it high, and even the most cynical veterans felt something stir in their chests. This was no longer about tactics or numbers. This had become something ancient and primal, a test of faith against the pitiless mathematics of war. They rode south through terrain that seemed designed by God to favor the massive army they hunted. Open plains where cavalry superiority meant everything. Rocky hills that concealed Saladin's scouts but exposed any Christian movement. The November heat was unseasonable, brutal, turning armor into ovens and leather into instruments of torture. Men drank sparingly from water skins that would have to last until they found the enemy or found death. Baldwin rode at the front, his white horse visible to all, his posture unnaturally rigid as he fought to remain upright despite the agony coursing through his diseased body. Behind him, the Templars rode in perfect silence, their discipline absolute, their prayers whispered into the wind. Saladin, meanwhile, was conducting what he believed to be a masterpiece of strategic maneuvering. His intelligence network had confirmed that Jerusalem's main army was days away in the north. The holy city lay essentially undefended. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: sweep through the coastal regions, resupply his army with the wealth of Christian towns, then turn inland and take Jerusalem before any substantial force could respond. He had divided his army into mobile raiding columns to maximize the territory they could plunder. His personal guard, still numbering several thousand, accompanied supply trains groaning with seized wealth. Gold, silver, foodstuffs, weapons, slaves, everything an army needed to sustain a siege of Jerusalem. His commanders were confident to the point of carelessness. Scouts reported a small Christian force somewhere to the north, but the numbers were so insignificant that Saladin didn't even alter his march. What could 500 men do against his host? On November 25th, near a place called Montgisard, destiny arranged its pieces on the board. The Christian scouts finally located Saladin's army, spread out in loose formation, their attention focused on protecting the vulnerable supply trains rather than preparing for combat. The Muslim soldiers were relaxed. Many had removed their armor in the heat. Weapons were stacked rather than held ready. They were an army in transit, not an army expecting battle. When Baldwin received this intelligence, he saw something that others might have missed. He saw not an army of 26,000, but an army of 26,000 who believed themselves invincible, who had grown careless in their certainty. He saw the one moment, perhaps the only moment, when those absurd numbers might not matter. The Templars formed up on a ridgeline, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun, their lances raised toward heaven. Baldwin positioned himself at the very front, the true cross beside him, its gold casing catching the light like a beacon. Below them, spread across the valley, Saladin's forces were beginning to realize something was wrong. Horns began to blow, commands were shouted, men scrambled for weapons and armor. But there wasn't time. Baldwin raised his sword, his bandaged hand somehow finding the strength to hold the weapon high, and he spoke loud enough for the front ranks to hear. God wills it. Today we teach the world that faith weighs more than numbers. Today we show them that 500 righteous men are worth more than 26,000 who doubt. Knights of Christ, follow your king into legend. The charge began not with a roar, but with a sound like thunder building on a distant horizon. 500 heavy cavalry moving from walk to trot to canter to full gallop down a slope creates a noise that makes the earth itself seem to scream. The Templars held their formation with supernatural discipline, a wedge of iron and horseflesh and absolute conviction pointing directly at the heart of Saladin's position. Their lances lowered as one, creating a forest of steel points that promised nothing but death. The horses, massive destriers bred for war, accelerated with terrifying power, their hooves throwing up clouds of dust that made the charging knights seem like they were riding out of a sandstorm summoned by God himself. The Muslim soldiers who saw them coming experienced something that transcends simple fear. They saw 500 men charging toward 26,000 and not slowing down, not hesitating, not showing even a flicker of doubt. It was insanity. It was impossible. It was therefore in that moment, utterly terrifying. The first ranks of Saladin's army, still scrambling to form defensive lines, took the Templar charge like a ship taking a tidal wave. The impact was catastrophic. Lances punched through shields, through chainmail, through flesh and bone. The sheer momentum of armored knights on massive warhorses simply erased the first defensive line as if it had never existed. Men were thrown into the air. Others disappeared beneath churning hooves. The sound was unholy, a mixture of screaming horses, screaming men, the crash of metal on metal, and underneath it all, the Templars chanting prayers to God and his mother. But the charge didn't stop. That was the detail that broke the enemy's cohesion. Conventional wisdom held that heavy cavalry made one devastating charge and then withdrew to regroup. The Templars didn't withdraw. They dropped their shattered lances, drew swords and maces, and kept fighting, pushing deeper into the Muslim army like a spear driving toward a heart. Baldwin was in the midst of it, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision despite his damaged hands, his white horse serving as a rallying point that drew his knights forward. The true cross-bearer stayed close, the relic held high, and for men, fighting and dying in the chaos, that cross became the center of their universe. Saladin's commanders screamed orders, trying to organize a coordinated response. They had the numbers. They had veteran troops. They should have been able to simply surround and annihilate this suicidal Christian force. But warfare is not purely mathematical. Psychology matters, morale matters, and the sight of 500 fanatics who seemingly couldn't be stopped, who kept coming despite impossible odds, began to inject poison into the Muslim army's confidence. Units that should have rallied instead hesitated. Soldiers looked for escape routes instead of fighting. The disciplined war machine that had marched south with such confidence began to develop cracks. The battle expanded into a sprawling nightmare of smaller combats. Templars fought back-to-back in clusters, surrounded but never overwhelmed, their training and superior armor keeping them alive against numerical superiority. Young squires who had never seen real combat found themselves fighting alongside legendary veterans, learning in blood and terror that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The Muslim cavalry, when they finally organized a countercharge, crashed into the Christian flanks with fury, and for terrible minutes it seemed the mathematics would reassert themselves. Templars were pulled from their horses. Encircled knights fought until they literally couldn't lift their weapons anymore. The sound of combat became a continuous roar without breaks or pauses. But something was happening in Saladin's camp that would prove decisive. The supply trains, loaded with plunder and essential equipment, had been positioned for march security, not battle security. Christian knights breaking through the main lines reached these vulnerable columns and began systematic destruction. Tents were set ablaze. Supplies were scattered or torched. Pack animals panicked and bolted, carrying precious cargo into the desert. More critically, the psychological impact of seeing their plunder, their reward for this campaign, going up in flames, caused Muslim units at the rear to break formation and rush back to protect their interests. The army's cohesion, already damaged by the shock of the Templar charge, began to disintegrate into chaos. Saladin himself, displaying the leadership that made him legendary, tried to rally his personal guard and mount a decisive counterattack. He rode along the lines, visible in his distinctive yellow armor, shouting encouragement and commands. For a moment it seemed he might succeed in turning the tide through sheer force of personality. His Mamluks, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood for war, formed a disciplined wedge and drove toward Baldwin's position. This was the crisis point. If Saladin could kill or capture the Christian king, the Crusader force would collapse. If Baldwin fell, Jerusalem would fall within weeks. Everything converged on a few dozen yards of blood-soaked earth where a leprous 16-year-old king fought against the greatest Muslim commander of the age. The fighting around Baldwin became mythic in its intensity. Templars formed a living wall around their king, taking wounds meant for him, dying to keep him alive. Baldwin himself, despite his disease, despite his damaged hands, fought with the fury of someone who had long ago made peace with death. His sword, slick with blood, rose and fell in arcs that seemed to bend physics. Beside him, the true cross swayed and dipped but never fell, the bishop who carried it fighting one-handed with a mace while refusing to release the sacred relic. This was no longer warfare in any conventional sense. This had become something ritualistic, almost religious, a moment where history itself seemed to hold its breath. And then the improbable became impossible. Saladin's guard, the finest warriors in his army, couldn't break through. The Templar wall held. Baldwin remained upright, remained fighting, remained visible to his men as a symbol that would not fall. More critically, other Christian units, seeing their king still alive, still fighting, found reserves of strength that shouldn't have existed. Men who should have been dead from exhaustion charged again. Knights who had been unhorsed fought on foot with captured weapons. The battle's momentum, that intangible thing that decides contests as much as swords and arrows, began to shift in the most unlikely direction imaginable. Muslim units began to break. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but in spreading cracks that turned into fissures. A company of infantry would suddenly realize they were fighting alone because the units beside them had retreated. They would fall back, exposing another unit's flank, causing them to retreat. The process fed on itself. Saladin's commanders recognized the danger and tried to organize fighting withdrawals, but retreat is the hardest maneuver in warfare, and doing it while under attack by an enemy that refuses to stop coming is nearly impossible. The organized withdrawal became a rout, the rout became a panic, and the panic became a catastrophe. The slaughter of the pursuit was terrible. Crusader knights, running on nothing but faith and fury, chased fleeing Muslims for miles. Men who had never considered retreat were cut down from behind. Saladin himself barely escaped, his personal guard sacrificing themselves to buy him time to reach his horse and flee. The great commander who had seemed invincible, who had united Islam's armies and sworn to reclaim Jerusalem, was reduced to a desperate flight through the darkness, listening to the screams of his dying soldiers. He would later describe it as the worst day of his life, worse than any defeat he had suffered or would suffer, not just because he lost, but because he had lost to an enemy he had dismissed as negligible. The battlefield at dawn revealed a scene that seemed torn from apocalyptic scripture. Bodies lay in configurations that defied description. Muslim soldiers who had died in the initial charge, Christians who had fallen defending their king, horses with broken legs or terrible wounds, weapons scattered like grain after harvest. The ground was dark with blood, the air thick with the smell of death and smoke from still burning supply wagons. Scavengers, both animal and human, were already beginning their grim work, and in the center of it all still, standing though swaying with exhaustion, was Baldwin IV, the leprous king who had done the impossible. The Christian casualties were severe despite the victory. Perhaps a third of the force that had charged down that hill would never charge again. Men who had survived found themselves unable to fully process what had happened. They had won. Against every calculation, every reasonable expectation, every law of military science, they had won. The Templars, those grim monks of war, wept openly as they knelt before the true cross, their faith validated in the most visceral way imaginable. They had been outnumbered 50-1 and had not just survived, but triumphed. It was the kind of victory that makes men believe in destiny, in divine providence, in forces beyond the purely material. The news spread across the Holy Land with a speed that seemed supernatural. In Jerusalem, where priests had been preparing for siege or massacre, church bells rang in disbelief and joy. In Damascus, where Saladin eventually limped back with the survivors of his shattered army, there was shock and soul-searching. How had the invincible been defeated by the insignificant? Muslim chroniclers, normally willing to find Allah's will in both victory and defeat, struggled to explain Montgisard. Some attributed it to Christian sorcery. others to tactical errors that multiplied beyond recovery. The most honest admitted that sometimes in war, the improbable happens, and all the planning in the world cannot account for 500 men who simply refuse to accept mathematical reality. For Baldwin, the victory bought time, but could not buy health. His leprosy continued its merciless progression. Within a few years, he would be unable to ride, unable to walk, unable even to see clearly as the disease consumed his eyes. He would rule from a litter, his body failing while his mind remained sharp and his courage undiminished. He died in 1185, 8 years after Montgisard, at age 24, having packed more legend into his short life than most men could achieve in 80 years. On his deathbed, surrounded by the relics and symbols of his faith, he reportedly smiled and said that God had allowed him to do enough, that the leprous boy king who everyone had written off had proven that worthiness is not measured in physical perfection, but in the courage to act when action seems impossible. Saladin never forgot Montgisard. In his later campaigns, when he finally did capture Jerusalem in 1187, he was far more cautious, far less willing to divide his forces or underestimate any enemy. The trauma of that November day had taught him that numbers alone don't win wars, that morale and leadership and the unpredictable nature of human courage can overturn any advantage. His Christian opponents noted that he never again displayed the same confident carelessness that had characterized his 1177 campaign. Montgisard had wounded him in ways that went deeper than physical defeat. It had introduced doubt into the mind of a man who had been certain of his destiny. The Templars who survived Montgisard became legendary even within their already legendary order. They had done what Templars were designed to do: hold the line when the line should have broken, fight when fighting seemed pointless, and win when winning was mathematically impossible. Their white mantles with red crosses became symbols not just of military prowess, but of faith so absolute it could reshape reality. Recruitment to the order surged. Young men across Christendom heard the story and wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, something that had proven capable of miracles. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Montgisard was psychological and spiritual rather than military. It became proof, at least to believers, that faith could move mountains or at least defeat armies. It became a story told to Crusader children, to doubtful knights before battles, to pilgrims making the dangerous journey to the Holy Land. When later generations faced overwhelming odds, they would remember Montgisard and think perhaps, just perhaps, that victory was possible if they were willing to charge into the face of impossibility. The battle became more than history. It became mythology. The true cross, which had been carried into battle that day, continued to serve as the Kingdom of Jerusalem's most sacred relic until Saladin finally captured it a decade later at the disastrous Battle of Hattin. Muslims melted it down for gold or destroyed it. Accounts vary. But its loss was considered as devastating as the loss of Jerusalem itself. Yet, in a sense, Montgisard had already secured its legacy. That piece of wood, whether authentically from cavalry or not, had been present when 500 men defeated 26,000. It had been there when a leprous boy king taught the world that human courage and divine favor could overturn any odds. Its physical destruction couldn't erase what it had witnessed. Historians still debate the exact details of Montgisard. The numbers might have been somewhat different, though sources from both sides agree the disparity was enormous. The tactical specifics remain unclear, buried under centuries of legend and propaganda. But the core truth is undeniable. On November 25, 1177, a hopelessly outnumbered force charged into certain death and emerged victorious. Whether you attribute it to God, to tactics, to Saladin's overconfidence, to Baldwin's leadership, or to some combination of all these factors, the result remains staggering. It was one of history's most improbable military victories, a moment when the rules that govern warfare seemed to bend under the weight of sheer audacity. In the years and centuries that followed, Montgisard became a touchstone for anyone facing impossible odds. Warriors invoked it before desperate battles. Priests cited it in sermons about faith and courage. Poets wrote epics trying to capture the sublime madness of that charge. Artists painted Baldwin on his white horse, the true cross gleaming, 500 knights thundering down a hill toward an army that covered the earth. The images might be romanticized, the details embellished, but the essential truth endures. 500 defeated 26,000. The dying king outlasted the confident sultan. The impossible happened because men believed it could and acted accordingly. Today, standing on the hills near Montgisard, now called Tel Geezer, you can look across terrain that hasn't changed much in 800 years. The same sun beats down. The same winds blow across open plains where armies once clashed. There are no monuments here, no plaques explaining what happened. The blood has long since been absorbed by the earth. The bodies have returned to dust. But if you know the history, you can almost hear it. The thunder of heavy cavalry, the clash of steel on steel, the prayers whispered by men preparing to die, the impossible sound of 500 voices shouting defiance at 26,000. And standing there in that place where courage rewrote the mathematics of war, you understand something fundamental about human nature. That numbers don't always matter. That faith, whether in God or cause or king, can be a force more powerful than any army. That sometimes, just sometimes, charging into certain death with absolute conviction is not stupidity, but the highest form of wisdom. That on one November day, in 1177, 500 men looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible simply meant no one had tried hard enough yet. And they were right.